Darius Coleman sat in first class, a successful CEO accustomed to luxury. He had pre-ordered his meal, lobster bisque followed by filet mignon, exactly what he always chose. But when the flight attendant returned with an apologetic look, telling him they were out of his meal, something inside him snapped. What should have been a routine flight became the spark for something much bigger. In that moment, Darius realized it wasn't just a mistake, it was deliberate. The coldness in her tone, the dismissive shrug, the way she offered him a meager sandwich and tap water while the other passengers dined on caviar, it all pointed to something deeper. He knew this wasn't an accident. He wasn't just another CEO. He wasn't just another passenger. He was the only black man in the cabin. And in that instant, he could feel it more than ever, that sense of being underestimated, disrespected, and dismissed once again. Darius Coleman wasn't the type of man to let that slide. He wasn't going to make a scene. He wasn't going to raise his voice or demand an apology. No, he was going to make them pay. Quietly. Strategically. Decisively. What happened next would change everything, not just for Stratus Air, but for how privilege, bias, and accountability intersected in the world of elite travel. If you haven't subscribed yet, now is the time. Trust us, you'll want to see how this story unfolds. Darius Coleman was no stranger to commanding boardrooms and managing multi-billion-dollar deals. His presence alone commanded respect. As the CEO of a multinational tech conglomerate, he had built his empire on precision, foresight, and unshakable confidence. He traveled often, usually in first class, where every detail, from the champagne selection to the pillow thread count, was meticulously curated to cater to high-profile clientele like himself. That evening's flight, Stratus Air Flight 917, was supposed to be no different. It was a direct route from New York to Geneva, where he was scheduled to finalize a major European expansion deal the following morning. Dressed in his tailored navy suit and polished loafers, he moved through the first-class cabin with the same quiet confidence that accompanied him in every business negotiation. The smell of fresh linen and chilled Dom Perignon filled the air, a carefully crafted illusion of luxury that Stratus Air prided itself on. As he settled into his seat, Darius opened his tablet, diving into the merger presentation that was set to finalize the next morning. His mind was already miles ahead, strategically planning for the next big leap in his company's European expansion. But despite his focus, something was off. He could feel the soft murmur of passengers around him, the quiet hum of the plane's engines, everything was as it should be. But then the flight attendant came by, offering him the menu. He barely glanced up. He'd already pre-ordered his meal, as he always did, knowing exactly what he wanted, lobster bisque followed by filet mignon. A luxury, yes, but also a symbol of the treatment he had come to expect from companies like Stratus Air, which catered to its high-paying customers. He placed the order calmly, almost as an afterthought, and returned to his work. But the attendant's response was different this time. She hurried off almost too quickly, and he sensed something wasn't right. Moments later, she came back. The tightness in her smile was obvious. "I'm sorry, sir," she said smoothly, though there was something about her tone that didn't sit well with him. "We're out of the luxury meal options. You'll have to choose from the regular selection." Her voice was polite, but there was a distinct lack of sincerity behind it. Her body language was dismissive, her gaze avoiding his. She turned and walked away before he could even respond. Darius blinked. "Asterisk out?" "I pre-ordered, asterisk." His jaw tightened, but his expression remained impassive. For over a decade, Darius had flown with Stratus Air. Never once had his pre-ordered meal been overlooked, let alone in first class. He stared at his tray, a pathetic turkey sandwich with limp lettuce and lukewarm water. It felt like mockery. Meanwhile, the other passengers around him, all white men in tailored suits, were being served with a lavish display of caviar and champagne. It wasn't just about the meal. It wasn't even about the oversight. It was about the attitude. The dismissiveness. The lack of apology. The rush to move on like nothing had happened. He scanned the room. His gaze locked onto the other passengers, 6 men, all seated comfortably, sipping champagne and chatting. They hadn't noticed what had just happened. Nor would they ever. To them, the flight was just another mundane routine. But to Darius, this was something else entirely. This wasn't just a mistake. This was a pattern. Darius wasn't new to this kind of treatment. He had lived with subtle racism his entire life, the unspoken assumptions that he didn't belong in certain spaces, that he didn't deserve the same level of treatment as others. He had seen it in meetings where people assumed he was the intern. In hotel lobbies where staff ignored him until someone else vouched for him. In restaurants where waiters took longer to serve him. And now, here it was again, on a private jet catering to global elites. But Darius wasn't impulsive. He didn't react out of emotion. He acted with purpose. For the next 10 minutes, his mind churned with a quiet fury. He couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a random failure of service. Something had happened behind the scenes. As he tapped his fingers on the armrest, he realized he had been cast aside, reduced to someone not worth the effort. But Darius wasn't someone who would allow this kind of treatment to go unanswered. His phone buzzed. It was Marcus Brandt, his assistant. "Everything okay?" Darius wasn't going to sit there feeling humiliated. He wasn't going to let Stratus Air get away with this. He responded with one sentence. "Initiate internal audit protocol. Flight 917. Cabin crew ID needed. Confirm when ready." It wasn't just about his meal anymore. It wasn't even about the flight attendant who had dismissed him. This was about sending a message. He would expose this culture of exclusivity, of overlooked promises, and turn it into a lesson for everyone at Stratus Air. As the flight continued, Darius remained calm. His expression was unreadable. The flight attendants went about their duties, none of them knowing what was happening in the background. They were too busy serving drinks and chatting with the other passengers, paying no mind to the man who had been made to feel invisible. But Darius had already set his plan in motion. By the time the plane landed in Geneva, everything would have changed. Marcus Brandt, Darius' sever-vigilant assistant, was already deep into the airline's employee records. His fingers moved swiftly over the keyboard, pulling up the personnel files of the flight attendants on board. He knew that Darius's requests weren't casual. Everything had a purpose. He accessed the records, confirming his suspicions about the staff's behavior. One particular flight attendant, who had denied Darius his meal, had a history of complaints, discriminatory remarks, rude behavior, and even passive-aggressive comments about prioritizing certain guests. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was systemic. In the corporate world, the smallest act of disrespect can cause ripples. For Darius, it was never just about getting even, it was about exposing the system and forcing change. Making sure that no one would ever be treated this way again. Back on the plane, Darius tapped the service button again, this time more deliberately. When the older flight attendant approached, there was a visible hesitation in his step. Like he already sensed something had shifted. Darius wasn't the same man who had quietly ordered his meal earlier. His voice was calm but firm as he asked for clarification on the meal issue again. His eyes never left the attendant's face. "I pre-ordered a luxury meal," Darius said, his tone pointed. "And yet I've been given something else. You mentioned something about prioritizing guests. Can you explain that?" The flight attendant stammered, clearly caught off guard. Before he could respond, Darius cut him off. "I understand." His words were deliberate. Precise. "I understand completely." The flight was nearing its descent into Geneva, but Darius was already several steps ahead. His next move would be the final one, and the results would be undeniable. As the plane touched down, he knew Stratus Air would feel the impact of his quiet decision. It was no longer about him, or the flight attendants. It was about making sure that an airline that prided itself on luxury finally understood what true respect meant. Once on the ground, two sharply dressed airline officials were waiting for him. Darius walked past them without a word. He had already sent the video evidence to Stratus's CEO. The request for a full audit was already underway. What the flight attendants didn't know, what no one knew, was that Darius had set a trap that would expose every subtle form of discrimination that had been overlooked for years. When the cabin crew disembarked, they wouldn't be greeted by the usual routine. They would be met by a team of HR officers. No longer would their behaviors go unchecked. No longer would their dismissive attitudes be tolerated. And as they would soon find out, Darius Coleman wasn't someone to be underestimated. As he watched the crew unknowingly move toward the exit, Darius felt a sense of satisfaction. He didn't need to say anything to them. He didn't need to make a spectacle. They would soon realize that their behavior had consequences, consequences they couldn't escape. The transformation had already begun. As the plane touched down in Geneva, Darius Coleman's plan was already in motion. The cabin crew, still unaware of what was coming, went about their usual routine, thinking everything was fine. But the reality was far from that. The minute they stepped off the plane, they were met by HR and security personnel. Their careers unraveled before their eyes. They had no idea that their actions, small slights of discrimination, dismissive attitudes, and favoritism, had just led to their termination. All because they didn't recognize the power seated in seat 1A. The flight attendants who had underestimated Darius didn't get a dramatic confrontation. Instead, they were quietly escorted away. Their employment records frozen. Their actions under review. This wasn't just a firing. It was a statement. One simple act of disrespect had unraveled the system of complacency that had allowed such behavior to go unchecked. Darius's message was clear: no one, no matter how high or low, should ever be treated as less than anyone else. By the time Stratus's leadership found out, the change was already in motion. It wasn't a loud protest or a public outcry. It was a quiet, calculated strike that left them no choice but to acknowledge the flaws in their service and culture. Darius had done more than just hold the crew accountable. He had sparked a shift in an entire company's values, proving that respect and equality are not optional. They are non-negotiable. The crew didn't just lose their jobs. They lost the privilege of thinking they could dismiss anyone. If this story struck a chord with you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Real Life Stories. Help us hit 10,000 subscribers so we can continue bringing you powerful stories like this one, stories that inspire real change. Because sometimes, the most powerful moves aren't the loudest ones. Sometimes, justice comes quietly. And when it does, it changes everything.